So we ended yesterday by reflecting on the nature of prayer and the power of prayer to be a force of transformation. But what changes? At what level does prayer make things different? There's a fair amount of scientific research into the power of prayer, for example, directed at a distance to someone who's sick in hospital. I think the evidence is, from a scientific point of view, rather ambivalent, but some of the evidence seems to suggest that it is beneficial, that if you pray for people at a distance, a group of people are praying for someone who is sick, then they will be better or get better. I don't think the evidence is very rigorous, but it suggests some connection. And I remember once at a conference with the Dalai Lama, somebody asked him this question, and he said, well, maybe it works better, or I'm quite sure the exact words he used, but anyway, something to the effect that maybe the prayer for the sick person works better if there's a strong karmic connection. In any case, that's how the world, and from a scientific point of view, tends to think of prayer as something that will change external circumstances and make people feel better or make the world a more peaceful place if we pray long enough and hard enough. And that attitude to prayer as a force of transformation is one interpretation of the words of Jesus. Ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be opened, seek and you will find. It's one interpretation of those words, but of course we can't take those words literally, otherwise we would all have won the lottery at least 6 times. So we need to understand that conviction of Jesus. Think of the conviction of Mother Julian when she had this insight into the single great deed that God would perform in the fullness of time to make all things well. This conviction of Julian arising from her deep insight. So these words of Jesus carry the same conviction and certainty, but how do we respond to that conviction and that certainty? Do we kind of hijack it at a egotistical level of personal preference and desire? In other words, I've got this mighty Lord who is going to give me what I want. Well, if you go down that track, you end up with the famous gospel of prosperity, which is probably going on 20 different TV channels in the US at this moment, exploiting the poor, especially the vulnerable, those who have little to comfort them except their fantasy, and exploiting them with this false interpretation of the conviction about the transformative power of prayer. So we ought to do a little better than that, and the church should do a little better than that. So what do we mean by prayer as a power of transformation? Who changes? And what changes? And how serious are we about embracing prayer as this way of transformation? And I was saying that, prayer is not what we do. That's the first thing we have to get over. It's not our technique. It's not our technology of manipulating these forces of the universe or twisting God's arm or bribing God. It's not what we do, but it's what we become. Prayer is what we become. Pray at all times, St. Paul says. And Jesus says, pray continuously. St. Benedict says, quoting the Psalms, give praise to God in everything that you think and do. So prayer, and if you look at John Cassian, great teacher of Christian meditation from the 4th century, the teacher of St. Benedict, this is exactly how he describes prayer, as being that condition or state in which everything we think and say and feel, and indeed every breath. Prayer is very often related to breath, either physically or metaphorically in the mystical literature. So even our very breathing becomes prayer. So we become prayer. Prayer is not what we do, it's what we become. And this is how we are changed. The first point of change in the power of prayer as transformation is the person who is praying, or being prayed, we might even say. And I was saying also, it was a long time ago now, last night, that we are not spectators in this experience. We've all been formed very powerfully in a culture of observation. We are viewers, we're an audience, we're customers, we're people being entertained by looking at someone doing something on stage or by looking at a screen. And we take these screens around with us now continually so that we maintain this strange and not very satisfying escapism of being a perpetual observer, a perpetual audience. And of course, an audience increasingly individualized with our own little private devices, and an audience that is in charge, at least to the degree that we control what we watch and we have the on-off switch or the replay switch. So we have to really confront this cultural force, this cultural influence that affects us all, affects people in villages in northern India as well as people in Burbank, California, or Elmhurst, Illinois. We've all been influenced by this, one of these great massive forces of technological change, and we've been influenced into becoming passive and observers. And prayer is the complete opposite of that. The one thing you can't be in meditation, if we take meditation in its traditional, wise sense, we'll come back later to different contemporary distortions of what meditation is, but if we take meditation for what it has always meant, then it's the complete opposite of this state of passive observation and ego control. We're not viewers looking at our own mental screens, but we are, in the Christian expression that St. Peter uses, we are sharers in the divine nature. And the recurrent and common message of the Christian tradition about prayer is that this transformative power arises through knowledge, not through information, not through observation. Jesus said, "You cannot observe the kingdom of heaven coming." So we can't see it on the screen. We won't be there with our camcorder to capture the moment of enlightenment. But this experience of transformation, let's call it that, or metanoia, as the gospel calls it, this change of mind, this radical change of the pattern of our perception and consciousness. That's what St. Paul was talking about in Romans last night. Let your minds be remade and your whole nature thus transformed. Adapt yourselves no longer to the pattern of this present age, but let your minds be remade. So this power of transformation comes through knowledge, gnosis, the Greek word that covers perception, not information. It's not Google-type knowledge. It's not information and facts, wonderful though that may be. But it's the gnosis that is a saving knowledge. It's a healing knowledge. And this knowledge arises from stillness. Be still and know that I am God. The stillness is released. This knowledge is released in stillness, and in that stillness, the knowledge that it reveals is of a different kind from the knowledge we are ordinarily familiar with. And this is really what prayer means. Prayer, in the understanding of the early desert teachers, first sort of organized, although they weren't so well organized, but the organized contemplative teachers of Christianity, was that prayer without the activity of thought or imagination releases this knowledge. Prayer is the laying aside of thoughts, remember. It's not thinking about God. It needs effort to lay aside your thoughts. It needs perseverance because it doesn't happen in one session or 6 sessions. But we shouldn't use too much effort because then our ego begins to try to be in control of it. Therefore, it becomes a spiritual path of some subtlety, and it leads us very quickly into the awareness that this is a journey that we make with others. Earlier this year, I was teaching a course at Georgetown Business School on meditation and leadership. And I was quite dubious about doing it at first, but I thought it was worthwhile. I think whenever we teach meditation from our tradition, without in any way concealing or compromising its roots and its essence, this is evangelization. So I did this course, and I was quite curious. It filled up very quickly, and I wasn't sure whether it was just because it looked like a fluffy course and made a break from accountancy and marketing and, I don't know, the other things. But in fact, I discovered very quickly that these young second-year MBA students, about 27, 28 years old, were really very serious students. And one of the best groups I ever worked with. They were a mixed group as far as all sorts of things went, but one ex-Marine who had just come back from Afghanistan, one of the most gentle people you could have met, and mixed races, different religious types, some not religious at all, different personalities, of course. And I said to them at the beginning of the course, this is 6 weeks, and I am asking you to meditate twice a day for these 6 weeks. And if you don't do that, the course is a bit of a waste of time for you and for me. Because what I'm going to speak to you about means nothing, really, unless it is anchored in your own experience. And your own experience will become your teacher. As John Cassian remarks, experience is the teacher. So if you don't do it, you're not going to learn anything. You'll just have ideas, and you may get a good grade at the end of it, but you won't really have got anything meaningful out of it. So anyway, for some reason or other, they responded very generously, and they had an average. We gave them some ways of measuring their progress. So they were MBA students after all. So there was a meditation log that they could tick off morning and evening sessions, and they had a performance rate of an average of 72%, which is pretty good, I thought. And but what was even more remarkable was to see how the experience that they were willing to open themselves to through the discipline, and this was a discipline in their busy and distracted lives, that experience was indeed teaching them something, and it was a real experience that was producing fruits. And they were experiencing prayer at this level of what we call contemplative prayer. I doubt whether many of them went to church. There was one guy I remember was going to be confirmed later that semester, but on the whole, I don't think they were church-going or temple-going or synagogue-going students. Nevertheless, they were in this experience that each of those synagogues, temples, or churches, or mosques are talking about every week. But they were actually experiencing it. And how did they experience it? They described it in very much the same way at first as children will describe the effect of meditation when they learn it in the classroom. They will say, "I like it." Well, actually, the students, the MBA students, saw it as a challenge, which I think school kids don't. Young children don't see it as a challenge. They see it more as a game, as a play, which they like. But anyway, the experience itself was a good experience. It was beneficial. And the students, the MBA students, felt they saw the results. I mean, one guy said, "I've been walking to college every day along the same route for the last 2 years." And he said, after a week, I think, of meditation, he said, "I've suddenly realized what kind of road it is I'm walking along. I see I just see it. And it's quite an interesting street, actually. Lots of interesting things happening on it, and nice buildings and nice flowers and so on." So he just noticed it. He hadn't noticed it before. And then at a personal level, they began to realize that this experience, which only 3 or 4 of them were doing 100%, I was surprised that even that many did. That means twice a day, every day. But even those who were doing it at less than 100% noticed the fruits of the practice in their relationships with other people. 3 of them were getting married, and their fiancés all remarked on the changes, the beneficial changes that they noticed in them, and at least in one case they began to meditate together because they were more attentive to each other. And, or, for example, the girl who said, she said, I have to work late with a study group that I'm with, and we're working on a project, and when we finish at about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, we all just go our own way. And she said, I suddenly thought, well, I'm driving, and some of them may not have a car, so I offered them a lift. Small, but she said I just suddenly was aware of that. So these are small, but don't underestimate the power of the small changes that they noticed themselves and that made them think at a much deeper level about the meaning of their work, of their life, and of their inner meaning. So, it's all about changing the patterns that we get into, that we don't even recognize as patterns. If we see something as a pattern, we know that it can change. There's some hope. Maybe there's also a fear that pattern may not be sustained, because it's a nice pattern sometimes. I'm having a really good time. I wonder how long it will last. But just to be aware of a pattern is to have hope that things can improve, and also to learn the wisdom of impermanence, so that when things do change, you can roll with it rather than being traumatized by loss. We all agree that things should change. The question is how? And when we look at the plane that came down in the Ukraine, or we look at what's happening in Palestine, these are examples of patterns that we're only too familiar with, patterns of violence, meaningless hatred, destruction, that don't do anybody any good. The pattern of violence has never produced a more peaceful world. This year is 100 years since the Great War that was claimed to be the end of all wars. So we agree that things should change, but we have very different views about how they should change. And the fact that we have those different views and we can't talk or listen adequately to those different views means that our differences create more conflict and competition that simply feed back into the same old archaic patterns that are in place. And even great institutions committed to renewal, committed to new ways of thinking and seeing, and new ways of managing the world. These great institutions of renewal and reform, institutions like the UN, or like the church, or universities and colleges, healing institutions, hospitals, legal institutions, offering us a way of law to resolve our conflicts. Even these great institutions, in which we place what little hope we have, can become bastions of self-interest and corruption, of professionalism or clericalism. And these institutions that can themselves become actually resistors to change. As Jesus warned, that religion can actually become a block to God. Religion can actually be the major institution to block your experience of God. And he got pretty angry with the clericalism of his own tradition, but it's clericalism that you will find in every religion. And so, although we can't withdraw our hope from these institutions, and some are better than others, and institutions can be changed, but we're sent back ultimately to the personal dimension. If we want things to change on the big scale, we have to accept it must begin with me. Even in a marriage or a community where you are we're usually very well aware of how other people should change for their own good, and we usually tell them how they should change for their own good. But that isn't going to take you very far unless you yourself are prepared to change. If we want to change the universe, says an ancient Chinese saying, if you want to change the universe, you have to change the earth. And if you want to change the earth, you have to change society. If you want to change society, you have to change the family. If you want to change the family, you have to change yourself. And so there's no way of escape, I think, from this personal dimension of change as a way of linking to our hopes or our work for change on a bigger scale. And we have to hope that enough of the leaders of the most important institutions will themselves be on a personal trajectory of change. That they themselves, there will be enough leaders who are in touch with this transformative experience within themselves to be able, in a small way, and for a limited time, because they don't stay at the top for very long, but in a small way and for a limited amount of time, they will be able to have their influence and make their profession or their institution a better place, better adapted to be a force for change and progress in the world. In our own community, and on a relatively small scale, of course, I think we're trying to explore what this means in terms of our own mission through meditatio, which is we've been having outreach from day one. We never said no to anyone who asked us to teach them to meditate. But the meditation group has always been open to everybody. We don't ask to see their baptismal certificate when they turn up for a meditation group. So we've always, from the very beginning, with Father John's vision, been open to share this gift of meditation with everyone and anyone. But as time has passed and groups have multiplied and community has grown, we saw that there were patterns, ways in which we were doing this outreach. And perhaps we could do it a little better if we organized it a little better and allowed people to share this gift, this wonderful gift of meditation, with others more generously, more widely. And there's been a very good response. Now, we've identified a number of ways of outreach, fields, for example, education, meditation with children, and in universities. And we find, certainly with schools, a very warm welcome, many invitations coming in. What we need are more people like you to go out into the schools and speak to the teachers and bring it to the children through the teachers. There's no shortage of demand. The harvest is rich. It's the laborers that are few. And every one of you has a gift to share, or a way of sharing this gift. In business, in finance, it's in a real ethical crisis at the moment. The financial world has not learnt the lessons of the 2008 crash, and many of the top leaders in the financial world are very conscious that it's unsustainable. That horrible word, sustainability. That their huge money-making and obscenely wealthy institutions are just heading for another crash, which may just increase again, as before, the wildness of the circus that started. So we can make small contributions in these ways, and they're very small. But let's, again, not underestimate the power of the small. Or in medicine, we've done fantastic things with medical science. We've ended bloodletting, for example, which killed George Washington. I think they took 6 pints of blood out of him before he died. It was the only way known to handle diseases you didn't know what to do with, was do bloodletting. Even the last book on bloodletting as a clinical practice was written at the beginning of the 20th century. So we've come a long way in medical science and know how to control many diseases that were taking lives unnecessarily. But at the same time, we have medicalized life. And our idea of health has become medicalized, which has a debilitating effect not only upon the healing relationship of the doctor or the clinician with the patient. So you really have to pay quite a lot of money now to get your doctor to look you in the eyes and make eye contact with you. One of our community in London went recently to see a doctor who had been her cancer doctor, and she went for a sort of checkup after, and she went into the room, and he was looking at his files or his computer, and he just, without looking up at her, he said, "Sit down," and so he was reading the files, and he said, "Have I seen you before?" And she said, "No, but I've seen you." And he looked up at her then, very quickly. And he said, "Well, I see a lot of people every day. I can't remember, you know." So we've made great advances, but more and more, I would say the majority of clinicians in the medical profession are very conscious that a paradigm shift has to occur, that a new model of health, a new understanding of health and the meaning of medicine has to be recovered, taking advantage of all the great scientific advances we've made, but recovering the human and indeed the spiritual dimension, which has been so often abandoned. So in these fields, in education, in business, in medicine, we're working at an institutional level, but of course we're working through individuals. And what are we doing in those situations if we have enough people who can go in and teach? Well, we're simply teaching meditation in exactly the same way, essentially, as we do in your weekly meditation groups. It's the same thing. We're just saying, do it. And let's do it together. Because if we do it together, you'll find you'll see the benefits. And then your own experience will teach you. But this doesn't mean that the teaching of meditation has become professionalized. You can't professionalize it in that sense. You can do it better, but you can't professionalize it because it remains at that ultimate level of personal transformation. It has to be personal, otherwise it isn't what it says it is. And in that sense, it is the great leveler, it's the great equalizer. In Boston, there's a young Anglican woman priest who runs a meditation group at the cathedral in Boston for homeless people. And when I meditated with them, they're homeless people. Many of them look homeless, and they have the kind of personality. Some of them have personality characteristics that you would associate with that. But quite amazingly, the 30 minutes of meditation were 30 minutes of pure silence and stillness and you knew definitely that they were into it, that they were doing this work. And if you look up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, you'll see interviews with some of them describing how they have meditation as part of their particular lives. So, the teaching of meditation offers us a lot of hope, but it's countercultural, and it should be countercultural, and it will always be countercultural. Because the old patterns, those old patterns that resist change, these are the old patterns that the New Testament sometimes calls the world. The world doesn't mean, the secular world outside of the church. The world means the old patterns that resist this transformative experience of the touch of God. So these old patterns are so strong and so embedded that they often simply absorb the forces of change that confront them. They're very strong. In modern culture, this happens particularly by the old and most dominant pattern of all, which is the pattern of egotism, of self-centeredness, the mother of them all. This is what causes exploitation and abuse, corruption, injustice, and oppression. And this old, archaic pattern of egotism simply swallows whatever new pattern will threaten it. Doesn't even have to fight it, it just has to swallow it. So think of the story of David and Goliath. Do you remember the Israelites who in the Old Testament are often a curious combination of paranoia. They feel the world is all against them, their neighbors are all against them, but also of oppression. They've went in and wiped out their enemies. Anyway, the Israelites saw themselves as the little guy facing the giant enemies surrounding them. But at a deeper level, the smallness of David in that story of David and Goliath has great meaning for us. Let's remember the story. Goliath was 6 cubits and a span tall. I don't know how big that is, but he was pretty big. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs were bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. So, pretty intimidating symbol of power and force. And for some inspired and ridiculous reason, the Israelites decided to get little David or he offered, didn't he, to go and fight them, fight the warrior of the Philistines. And so they dressed him up in his own suit of armor, and but then he said, I can't wear this. I'm not used to wearing this kind of stuff. So he took it off, and he went up to the front of the ranks to face Goliath carrying just his staff and his sling, with his stone in it, of course. And Goliath looked down at him from his majestic height. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. That's the pattern. That the great forces, those patterns that embody the great forces of oppression, look down and despise the weak, however healthy or handsome they may be. They despise them. But we know what happened. David used his little sling and his little pebble, and it went into the guy's forehead and killed him. The old patterns, in other words, are destabilized, can be destabilized. They can be brought down. The mighty are brought down from their thrones, it says in the Magnificat. But they're not brought down by force. These old patterns, these oppressive patterns, it's what causes the plane being shot down, or what's happening in Palestine. These old oppressive patterns are masters of force. They know how to deal with force. You have to use an incredible amount of force to defeat them, and if they do, then that force simply becomes a new tyrant. Bring down one tyrant by force, and the successor becomes a tyrant themselves. They will always win. But the wisdom that we have to remember, and we have to remember it in our own lives as we think about changing the patterns within ourselves as well, that it is not by force that this transformation occurs, but by gentleness, by intelligent smallness. And this is a recurrent pattern throughout the scriptures and in all the scriptures. Think of Elijah in his cave, running away from the oppressive force that was pursuing him, and hiding in the cave. And then there came the earthquake and the great storm and the fire. But God was not in any of these. But then there came the gentle breeze, and God was in that breeze. And the transformative experience happened because he recognized and connected with the power of God in that smallness, in that small, gentle breeze. And then he was changed, and then he got up, and he went back to his life and his work. And this smallness is the heart of the gospel, and it runs against the recurrent pattern of the world. The world's old pattern just repeats itself continuously. Same story, new actors. But the heart of the gospel reveals an alternative, a gentle alternative, a non-violent alternative. The world's old pattern relies upon growth, and multiplying and destroying and increasing power. It's the pattern of corporate or banking strategy. How many great corporations today really have any understanding of this wisdom of smallness? They don't see it at all. The closest they come to it is in customer relations. which are usually pretty pathetic. So, they'll spend millions on presenting themselves as customer-friendly, but you don't get a friendly person at the interface. So, the corporate world has very little understanding in most of the large corporations. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but in most of the world's largest corporations, this wisdom is completely lost. I mean, it's a difficult wisdom to stay in touch with at the best of times. But what happens when it is lost on such a massive scale is really frightening. But the same could apply to the church, which set out at a certain point in its history on this path of world domination. In 1900, a group of Christian missionaries were meeting in Edinburgh, and the height of the British Empire, and they said, well, this may be the last time we have to meet, because the world is just about to become completely Christian. We've done it. Thank God. The corruption of the small by the big is a constant danger. And that's why, in the spirit of the gospel, we can recognize that sometimes failure, disappointment, or death may be friends. They may be ways in which the small is preserved and protected. But the real witness to the power of the small, of the gentle, of the human scale is the life of the Spirit, the knowledge, the gnosis, that it releases in those who follow it. And that is characterized by what we call joy and peace. Another example of this is the life and the teaching of Thérèse of Lisieux. She was a young French girl who must have had a huge ego. At the age of 15, she insisted on going into a Carmel, a convent, and she then struggled for the next 9 years of her life before she died of TB. She struggled and recorded her struggle, became a doctor of the church. And she was struggling with the sense that she wanted, this was her ego, not a bad thing in itself, she wanted, to change the world. And how was she going to change the world? She should become a missionary and go off to darkest Africa and convert all the natives. But here she was in this little convent in a small town in northern France. And then her breakthrough came. And her breakthrough was discovering where change really comes from. And she called it her little way, the little way of Saint Thérèse. And it was built on two simple principles: seeking God in everyday life. First of all, the principle that God shows love through mercy and forgiveness. And secondly, that she herself could not be perfect. So God reveals love through mercy and forgiveness, and we are not and cannot be ever perfect. And as this insight grew and enlightened her, she was able to see how much the religion of her culture was built upon an excessive and neurotic fear of divine judgment that stifled the experience of God, the transformative experience of God. She said, how could anyone be afraid of a God who became a child? Pretty simple insight into the nature of Christianity, one would have thought. She was committed to the small tasks of her life and the people that she met in her community. Her tasks were carried out in the sacristy, in the refectory, and in the laundry. The last 18 months of her life, she endured a very dark night of the soul. On her deathbed, she said, I only love simplicity. I have a horror of pretense. I only love simplicity. I have a horror of pretense. We'll end with this. We should not say improbable things, she said. We should not say improbable things or things we do not know. We must see their real, not their imagined lives. And I think that serves as the best description of what we mean by meditation as a way of life. Not meditation as a technique that the ego is manipulating for its desired results, but meditation, like the gospel itself, the gospel is not an ideology, meditation is not a technique. They're deeply intertwined as a way of life, a spiritual life. Simplicity, and we cannot meditate from day to day while keeping up pretenses. We have to drop the pretense, the masks, the self-delusion. And when that pretentiousness gradually drops in us and the ego is restored to its proper and smaller role, then we have our own breakthrough, just like Saint Teresa did, just like David in the face of Goliath. We have our own breakthrough. And it's a breakthrough that recognizes the power of the small and the everyday, the sacramental vision of life, rather than the Hollywood vision of life in which everything has to be on a huge scale. And the smallness of the mantra is the heart of the experience of meditation. It's a very small, little work to do. As small as laying the table, or as ironing your clothes, or as, arranging a John Main seminar. The smallness of the mantra is its point. That's the point of it. And just to, as a sort of a refresher or reminder of that, what I'd like to do for just a few minutes before some of the meditation sessions during the retreat, starting at lunchtime, is just go through in a very short way, in a summary way, some of the main points of the 6-week introductory course that we've developed, which we're going to, well, we've had it out for a long time now, but we've worked on it a little bit, and we're going to publish it as a little booklet. It's also online as well on the school website. But we're going to publish it just as a little booklet, and it basically makes it even easier to introduce people to meditation using the 6-week model. So I'd like to just take you through, maybe just for 5 minutes before each meditation, some of those stages and essential points, which I hope will be, for those of you who are well aware of it, it will be a refresher, and for those of you who may be more new to it, it may be a further introduction.